This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 252. Some Freaks of Atavism. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I know I mentioned this is some freaks of atavism. Are you on the freakish side today? Are you going to let your freak flag fly?
Could you say that 3 times fast?
No,
freak
I cannot.
Flag fly.
No.
I like that very much.
Yes. Well, I try to let my freak flag fly as much as I can. So we will, in the meantime, put the flag at half-staff as we go to our housekeeping here. As show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles252. There you can find all of the associated things, including our social media accounts. We are at I Hear of Sherlock everywhere. And our email address, we are trifles@ihearofsherlock.com if you'd like to reach out and get in touch with us. And of course, you can also support the show. We've had a lot of new supporters come in on Patreon lately for as little as $1 a month. It helps us keep producing these quality shows that you have come to know and love. And we thank you for your support. Okay, well, we are going to go into genetics today. I think it's an interesting topic, one I explored almost by accident recently. I was inspired by a cartoon strip from our friends at Baker Street Elementary. Of course, that comes from our friends down in Texas, Steve and Rusty Mason and company. Comes from, I want to make sure I get the crediting exactly right. It is Mason, Fay, and Mason. And it follows the original adventures of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson as they and their friends work through the issues of elementary school in Victorian London. So it's cute. And here we had the kids lamenting about whether they would continue on in the shoes of their ancestors and their parents. And Holmes, of course, actually young Ignatius, who is Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, says his family had a history of illustrators, but he hopes to carry on in his mother's storytelling skills. And Holmes mentions he has artists in his family going back to Vernet. And I think it's young Wiggins who says, if my parents are so smart, how do you explain my grades? He's typically the bad student there. And Holmes assures him not to be disappointed that sometimes it skips a generation. So, but it got me to thinking about the instances of the mentions of heredity in the canon and hereditary aspects. And, of course, we get this sense from Holmes in the Greek Interpreter, don't we? Where we are introduced to Mycroft.
Yes, we do. And this is another big deal. You know, in another episode of Trifles, you know, we've talked about a variety of things that are characteristic of the Victorian age. the habits, the views of nature and things like this. But in this point in history, you know, after Darwin publishes his great work in the middle of the 19th century, it sort of kicks off an exploration of evolution, which leads to studies of heredity, which eventually kick off sort of modern genetics. You know, there were people like Francis Galton and then Gregor Mendel, who began experimenting with all of this. So this was a very, you know, current kind of topic, and it certainly influenced thinking people who read widely. And so the observation, you know, and once you get some of these ideas in your head and you get to know more people and more personalities, and you meet their parents and you see their descendants, you know, you start to put these things together. And I think it was Francis Galton who came up with some theory that said, you know, the father would contribute a quarter of the hereditary influences and the mother with this number and that number, and started looking at things statistically like that. But in any case, you know, here you have this landscape in which many of the people that we see in the canon are introduced, you know, in terms of their personality and behavior and how it was, how that behavior was influenced by events in their lives or by their descendants.
Yeah, and I think Watson does a good job of explaining how they got to this point. As they were sitting around after tea one summer evening in the Greek Interpreter, he said the conversation had roamed in a desultory, spasmodic fashion. That's understating it. From golf clubs to the causes of the change of the obliquity of the ecliptic. And we came around at last to the question of atavism and hereditary aptitudes. The point under discussion was how far any singular gift in an individual was due to his ancestry and how far to his own early training.
Yeah, and atavism, of course, you know, is a tendency to revert to something ancient or ancestral. And Holmes is forever coming up with these sorts of observations. You know, art in the blood is liable to take the strangest turn and things like that. But as you point out, this is the absolute perfect moment with which to meet Holmes's brother.
Indeed, and that art in the blood quote actually followed that conversation where Holmes talked about his ancestors being, you know, his grandmother being a sister of Verney, and that Mycroft possessed the powers of observation and deduction even to a greater degree than Sherlock Holmes himself did.
Mm.
So they to me, you know, it's interesting because I think, you know, as Holmes was giving credit to his bloodline as focused on his abilities, he also did a lot of work. We've talked about this recently, that he put a lot of work in to get to the point that he did. He studied up. He became a student of criminal history. And he was able to kind of marry these genetic capabilities together with his experiences. So this whole nature versus nurture thing, there clearly is no one side on which Sherlock Holmes falls in judging whether this happens or not.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And it's not surprisingly that for Arthur Conan Doyle, this would be a topic that was forever, I think, in one way or another, in his mind because of his own experience with his father, who for much of his upbringing was ill, eventually institutionalized, addicted to alcohol, and yet was capable of, you know, remarkable art, incredible visual acuity. And I'm sure Conan Doyle wondered, you know, and in fact, I think I recall reading somewhere that Conan Doyle himself was suspicious of drink and that didn't, you know, he drank rarely, if at all. He was very, I suppose, worried that he would become, you know, addicted to alcohol.
And it's not surprising. I mean, that level of self-awareness about one's family tendencies, one's family's history, is certainly appreciable. And perhaps Conan Doyle categorize those who fell prey to their family heredity, their hereditary tendencies, as weak and as those who would be criminal in nature, right? Who would fall prey to the temptations of evil. It makes great sense that when we see other instances of heredity pop up in the canon, that they would be associated with criminals.
Yes, absolutely. And the big one, of course, one of the early ones we see is Grimsby Royale in The Speckled Band. And his stepdaughter, Helen Stoner, is the source of all of the information we really have about Grimsby Royale's background. And she tells Holmes, well, when we came to this part of England, instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbors, who at first had been overjoyed to see somebody come back to the old family seat, he shut himself up. He seldom came out of the house except to have quarrels. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in men of the family. And in my stepfather's case, it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. So here, rather than engage in studies, engage in work that would mitigate this hereditary influence, because of his time in the tropics, it just built and built and built on Grimsby Royale, and that was the result.
So she's blaming this tendency toward anger management issues on sunstroke? Prolonged sunstroke, I see. In reading this, and look, I buy this at its face value. I mean, here was a young woman who basically had her life being threatened. But did she really? Was she simply throwing a story up here to Sherlock Holmes to paint her stepfather in a way? Remember, she was first on the scene there. She beat her stepfather to Baker Street, told her story, painted him in a certain way, and then Sherlock Holmes would come later on and eventually be responsible for her stepfather's death. Maybe this was a plot of Helen Stoner of getting her stepfather out of the way.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. She had, because she had also become an accomplished safecracker, she secreted her pet snake, Dave, in Grimsby Royale's safe. And when he opened it up, of course, he was completely astonished, and the snake bit him. Yeah, clearly.
Excellent. Well, hey, let's astonish everyone by taking a quick break here. We'll be back right after this brief word. Hey, here's a quick question. Did you get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual for 2020? Titled The Unique Hamlet, it was edited by Richard Sveum, and it concerned Vincent Starrett's classic pastiche. Many people are asking about this, and the reviews are spectacular. The only thing is, you can't get a copy. Why? Well, the only way you can get a copy of the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual every year is if you have an annual subscription. It's now 2021. Isn't it time that you took out a subscription to the Baker Street Journal? Not only will you get the 4 issues that arrive in the spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but you'll get that 5th Christmas annual issue as well. It's the only way to get that particular issue with one single topic, edited by some of the best Sherlockians in the world. Don't miss your opportunity to get a copy of the 2021 Christmas Annual from the Baker Street Journal at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right. And our hereditary tendency to go off on tangents continues here on Trifles. Seems to be in our blood. So we talked about Mycroft and Holmes and Verney. We talked about Grimsby Royale. Who else do we have that comes up in hereditary tendencies?
Oh, well, the big one is the master criminal, the great nemesis, Professor Moriarty. When Holmes tells us, the whole story in the final problem. Basically, that the professor, as you've pointed out, fell victim to his genetics. Holmes says, at the age of 21, he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which had a European vogue, and on the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities. He had a brilliant career before him, but the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers.
There we go. Criminal strain in the blood. Well, that's, again, exactly. Conan Doyle resorting to, this notion of heredity and the weakness in the criminal and being unable to avoid that tendency.
Well, the flaw there, of course, is sadly, well, maybe not sadly, but it's just sort of a fact. I'm struggling for the right word. It's not really haphazard, but I guess the casual way that Moriarty is handled in the canon. For example, we will later find out that Moriarty had at least one brother, and probably maybe two, and that one brother was a station master in England or something like that, and another brother was in the military, was a colonel. So, why would hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind? Now, maybe Moriarty and his brothers were all similarly affected. But,
could be. Or
we don't get any backstory. We get much more of a backstory about Stapleton, as an example, than we do about Moriarty.
Yeah. Well, it could be one of those things like when Gregor Mendel looked at, he used peas, wrinkled and smooth, green and yellow, to determine some traits. And the same occurs when you're looking at brown eyes, blue eyes, etc. Well, maybe the criminality was a recessive trait, and it went to only one of the sons rather than all three of them, right? So let's hope it was a recessive trait.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I wonder if anybody's written about that, recessive traits in evil characters in the canon.
That's a good question. Well, we need to understand more about some of their family history there, I would imagine. Well, Speaking of family history, there's another one. This is a smaller one, but it's significant nonetheless because I think it's very physically clear. In the Reigate Squires, or Reigate Puzzle, depending on which edition you have, there was a sheet of paper that was torn. Young William Kerwin was shot. He was holding a scrap of paper in his hand, a corner that had been torn off. And by that little bit, Holmes was able to determine that the two writers, and yes, there were two writers of the note, and they wrote every other word, that they were related. He said, of course, we do not know yet what the relations may have been between Alec Cunningham, William Kerwin, and Annie Morrison. The results show that the trap was skillfully baited. I am sure that you cannot fail to be delighted with the traces of heredity shown in the P's and in the tails of the G's. The absence of the I dots in the old man's writing is also characteristic.
Yeah, boy, some might say that's pretty fanciful, but it's lovely. It really is lovely.
It is.
And we find another couple of things happening in the canon. For example, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, I mentioned Stapleton earlier, but, there is a point in which, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, Holmes, gazing at the family portrait, finds a resemblance between Sir Hugo and, Watson sees something of Sir Henry in it, but Holmes covers the hat and hair with his arm, and there's more of a resemblance with Stapleton. And then the big moment, of course, where we have another great instance of heredity in the canon is with Colonel Sebastian Moran. And in The Empty House, Holmes tells Watson, we look at the career of Colonel Sebastian Moran, and Watson says, well, he was an honorable soldier. And Holmes says, well, up to a certain point, he did well. You know, Watson, he says there are some trees which grow to a certain height and then suddenly develop some unsightly eccentricity. You will see it often in humans. I have a theory that the individual represents in his development the whole procession of his ancestors, and that such a sudden turn to good or evil stands for some strong influence which came into the line of his pedigree. The person becomes the epitome of the history of his own family. And Watson, of course, listens to all of this and says, "It is surely rather fanciful."
Well, I don't insist on it. It may be true of sometimes, but not all the time.
That's right.
So some theory. It works except when it doesn't, like any good theory.
I like that. It works except when it doesn't. Yeah.
Well, that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
My singular gift for observation and deduction may have come from my grandmother, who was a sister of Vernet, the French artist. Your art in the blood is liable to take the strangest forms.